Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I ask for unanimous consent that all members be given 5 days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
It's an honor and a privilege to once again have this opportunity to stand on the House floor and to anchor the Congressional Black Caucus's Special Order Hour, where today we want to discuss some of the issues and challenges confronting this country that we hope this newly constituted Congress will be prepared to take up as we move into the 114th Congress. There's still a lot of business that's undone over the remaining few weeks that we have left during this session, but a whole lot of challenges that we've got to confront as we move forward. 150 years or so ago, President Abraham Lincoln publicly pondered the question, how do we create a more perfect union? And President Lincoln asked that question at a time when the country was tearing itself apart in the context of the Civil War. And since the conclusion of that war, since President Lincoln publicly pondered that question, year after year, month after month, century after century, we certainly have made some progress, significant progress here in America, but we still have a long way to go. And it's still relevant for us to ask the question, how do we create a more perfect union? Where do we go from here? And so I'm pleased that so many of my distinguished colleagues from the Congressional Black Caucus have come to the floor today to share their thoughts and their insight and their policy prescriptions in our continuing march toward a more perfect union. And so let me first just yield to the dynamic chairperson of the Congressional Black Caucus, who's provided such great leadership to this caucus, to this Congress, and to this country during her career, the distinguished gentlelady from Ohio, Chairwoman Marcia Fudge.
Before the gentleman recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, the chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to the amendment of the House to S-1086, cited as the Child Care and Development Block Grant Act of 2014.
The gentlelady from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to thank my colleagues Jeffries and Horsford for leading the National Black Caucus Hour. It is an issue that I think is important to this entire country. And it should be a priority for all members, not just members of the Congressional Black Caucus. A discussion on where Congress goes from here in pursuit of a more perfect union. Mr. Speaker, even before the final ballots were counted from the midterm elections, conservatives began sharing their priorities for the upcoming Congress. Instead of promising to improve our health care system, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle began promising to renew their campaign to repeal the Affordable Care Act, a campaign that's wasted millions in taxpayers' dollars with 53 unsuccessful votes. Instead of searching for common ground, they are still committed to finding a way to impeach President Barack Obama. Instead of using the next Congress to create more opportunities for the American people, the decision has already been made to continue efforts to obstruct and undermine the president. None of these actions will move our nation forward or do what's best for the country. We must do something more than advance a partisan political agenda. It's irresponsible, Mr. Speaker, and an insult to the very public that gave us this awesome responsibility in the first place. We were elected to represent the American people, all of the American people. Let's write and pass legislation that will make their lives easier and their futures more promising. It's time for this Congress to unite and move forward together. This is not the time for doubling down on the tactics of distraction, obstruction, and confusion. We have the opportunity now to lay a foundation for the 114th Congress that is built upon bipartisan cooperation and a shared commitment to doing what's best for all of our citizens. I urge my colleagues to join the CBC in doing the people's work. I yield back.
Thank the distinguished chair for her observations, and certainly for pointing out that while we should be coming together to march toward perfecting our union, there are some inexplicably who want to march toward impeachment before even seeing presidential action. Same type of folks who, from the moment that Barack Obama was sworn in as president, you believe he exceeded his authority just by raising his right hand and taking the oath of office. So let's just hope that we can hit the refresh button on the partisanship, on the obstruction, on the obfuscation, and come together to do the business of the American people. And certainly, the gentleman who I will yield to next has been a great patriot, helped to bring our Constitution to life for tens of millions of Americans. He's one of this country's greatest freedom fighters, a civil rights icon, and a distinguished member of Congress. It's my honor and my privilege to now yield to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Congressman John Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my friend and my colleague, Congressman Jeffries, for organizing this special order. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for speaking up and speaking out. Thank you for finding a way to get in the way. Mr. Speaker, our march toward a more perfect union has been long, hard, and tedious, but we must continue to move forward. I know there are forces that want to stop us, slow us down, and take us back. But as a nation and as a people, we have made too much progress to turn back. Through hard work, discipline, and with the blessing of the Almighty, we can and we will move to redeem the soul of America and create a more perfect union. The American people are ready. They have grown by leaps and bounds to build bridges of understanding between diverse communities. As their representatives, will we follow their lead? Can we work together in this body as one people, one family, who live in the same house, one house, the American house? We don't have to be mean to each other. We don't have to put each other down. My work in the movement taught me, my faith has taught me and many others to respect the dignity and the worth of every human being. There's some good in the worst of us because everything that is was made by our Creator. That's why we must respect the worth and dignity and that spark of divine in each one of us. As A. Philip Randolph, the Dean of Black Leadership, the visionary who planned the historic March on Washington in 1963, and the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters once said, we may have all come here on different ships, but we all in the same boat now. My colleagues, my brothers and sisters, we must keep the faith. We must press toward the mark of the public good and put our personal ambitions aside. As Mr. Jeffries did a few moments ago, let me paraphrase of a great Republican president who lived in a more divisive time even than our own. He said, brave men, both living and dead, had consecrated the American soil with their tears, their sweat, and their blood. The war will live, nope, not long remember what we said here, but it will never forget what we did here. We must be dedicated to the great task remaining before us and make sure that they did not sacrifice in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not pass from the earth. Thank you, Mr. Jeffries, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Lewis, for those very eloquent thoughts and for continuing to really function as the conscience of the CBC, as our caucus functions as the conscience of the Congress. It's now my distinct honor and privilege to yield to someone who I serve on the Budget Committee with. She's a distinguished member of the House of Representatives, a fighter for the people, for the disenfranchised, a voice for the voiceless. It's my honor to yield to the very distinguished Congresswoman, gentle lady from California, Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank the gentleman from New York, Congressman Jeffries, for this very important moment and theme tonight, where do we go from here, but also for your leadership in conducting these special orders to make sure that the American people really know the truth about what's taking place here in Washington, D.C., but also to hear the voice of conscience from the Congressional Black Caucus. We just heard from our great warrior, Congressman John Lewis. Also, I want to thank Congressman Horsford for being part of this for the last couple of years in terms of his tremendous leadership. You know, the other night, I had an event with young people in my district. It's a lecture series sponsored by the Martin Luther King Freedom Center. Our young people, Congressman Lewis knows these young people. They travel with me every year to Selma, Montgomery, Birmingham. These young people, we started the center in the 90s, and these young people's mission in life is to make sure that the new generation of leaders understand, one, that violence is not an option. Secondly, understand that we all are in this together, and we should be united as a country and fight for the American dream for all. The topic of last 2 nights ago, the lecture series was, where do we go from here, as I said earlier. And we had white students in the audience. We had African American, Latino, and Asian Pacific American young people, middle-aged people, no people. It was held at my alma mater at Mills College. And it was really amazing. We had the co-founder of the United Farm Workers, Dolores Huerta, former state senator Art Torres. And we talked about where do we go from here as a community in Oakland and also throughout the country. And what we need to do here is really get back to work for the American people. And that's what we heard over and over and over at our lecture series. You know, unfortunately, ever since the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, we see the governing through extortion and brinkmanship, including a government shutdown that cost the taxpayers $24 billion. I hope that's not where we go from here. Now we're looking at even, or at least some are saying that they're shut down and are refusing to act on immigration while planning another series of votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act. They've even gone so far as to threaten impeachment because our president has continued to lead where they failed. Where do we go from here, Congressman Jeffries? Let's hope not there. I hope we go where my young people in my community talked about the other night. And the threats about a government shutdown over immigration reform is outrageous. My district is a very diverse and dynamic district. That's what makes it really a great place for my constituents to live, work, do business, and raise a family. Yet we have many, many pockets of poverty. It's home to a vibrant immigrant community, families from all over the world. Many of them, and they told me again the other night, they're feeling the pain each and every day of our broken immigration system. It's been more than 500 days since the Senate passed bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform. We need to have an up or down vote. Families deserve that. Time is really running out. We have 3 weeks of session left, so we need to get something done. That's where we need to go from here. If Congress fails to act on immigration reform, our president can and he should take action to keep families from being torn apart. Just like every president since Dwight D. Eisenhower, our president should act. But as the President has said, immigration reform should come from Congress. It should come from us, and that's what my community said in terms of moving forward. Let's get it done in the next couple of weeks. We have a bipartisan bill. Let's come together and have a vote. Our colleagues across the aisle need to put our economy ahead of partisanship. That means stopping their repeated attempts of eliminating access to affordable quality health care for millions of Americans. This past weekend marked the beginning of the second year of open enrollment under the Affordable Care Act. Repealing the Affordable Care Act and its protections for families would hurt all of our constituents. It would make health care less affordable and less accessible. Yet every time Republicans vote to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, they make it perfectly clear that charging women for being a woman is okay, charging more, that denying victims of domestic violence coverage, that's okay, and allowing insurance companies to increase premiums to increase profits, and that's okay. Now, that's not what the American people need. Where do we go from here? Let's not go there. Millions have been covered, and let's move forward to make sure our country has universal, accessible, affordable health care for all. It is a basic human right. So we need to get back to doing the work of the American people, the work of forming a more perfect union. Finally, I just want to point out an article. It was a recent editorial in the New York Times from Nicholas Kristof, in which he discusses the historical and structural issues that continue to perpetuate racial disparities between blacks and white today. Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to insert this article into the record, please.
Without objection.
Thank you. Kristof states that black-white economic inequality is greater in America today than it was in apartheid South Africa, at ongoing discrimination against African Americans in the labor market, and at systematic bias in law enforcement. So young people of color, especially young men, have been left behind the economic recovery. It's leaving them behind, and far too often they are marginalized and forgotten. The poverty rate for African Americans is 27.2%, more than 2.5 times the rate of poverty of white Americans. Nobody in our country should have to live below the poverty line. We're the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world. African American unemployment rate is 10.9%, nearly twice the national average. Young men of color are stopped and frisked at will. They are more incarcerated than any other group. The jobs that are available don't pay enough to get by, while our safety net and nutrition programs continue to be hacked and slashed by House Republicans. And beyond the lack of opportunity, police misconduct and the criminal justice system are constant reminders of the tragic inequality which is still persistent in the daily life of black America. Where do we go from here? Let's move forward so that we remember that the deaths of Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner and Oscar Grant, one of my constituents, their deaths, we've got to remember, are tragic examples of the senseless murder of young black men. As the mother of 2 black men and 2 black grandsons, I have to have many uncomfortable conversations with them, how to walk, how to talk, how to interact with the police. This is not just my reality, but the reality of millions of other black mothers and grandmothers and fathers and grandfathers. This is something no parent should have to do. No one should be afraid of the police, who are sworn to protect and serve them. And these are issues that members of Congress must take leadership in addressing. This is where we must go from here. Finally, let me just say the work of building a more perfect union is just not rhetorical. As members of Congress, we really do have a unique opportunity to do just that. To quote our drum major for justice, who Congressman Lewis had the privilege and honor to work with, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., he said, "A genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus." We have the privilege tonight to remind this body that we are the molder of consensus. Thank you again, Congressman Jeffries, for the opportunity to speak with you this evening.
Thank you, Congresswoman Lee, for your very eloquent observations and for laying out a clear pathway as it relates to many of the challenges that we've got to confront here in America. And certainly amongst those challenges, that you spoke to, the notion that we've got a broken criminal justice system that in far too many communities has placed a target on the back of young African American and Latino men in a way inconsistent with the democratic values of this country and the notion that we were all created equally. And so I look forward to partnering with you on many of these issues as we all collectively move forward in this wonderful body. We've also been joined here today by another civil rights champion, someone who has fought for the disenfranchised and to make sure that everyone has equal opportunity under the law. He's the distinguished gentleman from the Lone Star State of Texas, and I'm pleased now to yield to Congressman Al Green.
Thank you very much, Congressman Jeffries. And I also thank, in his absence, Congressman Horsford. The two of you have been almost inseparable when it comes to these special order hours. I want to compliment you on the outstanding job that you've done. But I'd also like to compliment Congressman Horsford for the outstanding job that he has done on the Financial Services Committee. He brought his talents, he brought his brilliance, and he has represented his constituents exceedingly well. And I know that in the annals of history, when they look back through the vista of time, it will be said that he served us well in the Congress of the United States of America. With reference to the relevant question of the hour, as it relates to a more perfect union, as we ponder and query where do we go from here, it was appropriate, I think, that you introduced this topic by referencing President Lincoln. Appropriate because you're eminently correct. It was a time of great turmoil when he announced that he would issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And on January of 1863, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the country was in the midst of a civil war, being torn apart. There was much to be said about his announcement that he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation. There was great debate, and there were many people who said that it should not be done, that it was not worth the paper it would be written on, to be quite candid with you, was said because it would only free the slaves in the states that had left the Union, states that, quite candidly, at the time he had no control over. But he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and I thank God that he did, because by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he laid the foundation for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America that was, in fact, executed in 1865, December. But for the Emancipation Proclamation, I don't know that I would be sitting here in the Congress of the United States of America tonight. By issuing that Emancipation Proclamation, he changed the course of history. Dr. King was right. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. However, it doesn't do it on its own accord. It takes the hand of man and women to bend it. So I'm pleased that he did so. I'm also pleased that there was another opportunity for a president to forge a more perfect union. President Harry Truman had the opportunity in 1948 to issue an executive order, as was the case with Lincoln and the executive order for the Emancipation Proclamation. He issued an executive order to desegregate the military. There was much to be said about it. In fact, that executive order led to the birth of the Dixiecrats. There was a split in the Democratic Party because the Honorable Harry Truman decided that he would issue Executive Order 9981 to desegregate the military. He issued it, the military was desegregated, and I contend that this was also one of the many reasons why the country itself moved along to desegregation and integration. These were two outstanding and well-noted executive orders issued by presidents of the United States. If President Lincoln could issue an executive order, an Emancipation Proclamation, if Harry Truman could issue an executive order, the desegregation of the military desegregation, surely President Barack Obama can issue an executive order to lift many people who are living in the shadows of life, an immigration declaration, if you will. I believe the president should issue this order, notwithstanding all that's being said. There was much said and much being done when Lincoln issued his executive order. Much said and much being done when Truman issued his. Much said, much being done now. But I think the president should do this, and I think he should be bold when he does it, because he will be lifting people out of the shadows of life, and I am confident that while many will be angry with him, God will not. I think God will smile on the president for issuing this executive order. More than 15,000 executive orders have been issued. Not one president has ever been impeached for issuing an executive order. Not one. There's talk of impeaching President Obama. If we didn't impeach Lincoln, and we didn't impeach Truman, and we didn't impeach Reagan, and we didn't impeach many of the other presidents who have signed the more than 15,000 executive orders, I don't think that we ought to impeach President Obama. And finally this, as an aside, there's much talk about the president's legacy and what he has done to form a more perfect union while being president, if you will. But all of this talk about his legacy misses the mark, in my opinion, because there are many who think that the Affordable Care Act will be the centerpiece of his legacy. And I think it's a great piece of legislation. I supported it. I still support it. There are many who think that saving the auto industry would be his legacy. I think this is significant, exceedingly so. I supported what he did. There are others who believe that work in human rights and human dignity, especially as it relates to equal pay for equal work for women, will be his legacy. I think it's a great piece of work, and I commend him for what he's done. But the president's legacy in the eons to come will be that he became President of the United States of America. The mere fact that the Honorable Barack Obama was elected not once but twice speaks to our efforts to form a more perfect union. And I think that this greatest legacy will be his having served as President of the United States of America. That fact alone will be something that we will never, ever erase from history. I thank you for the opportunity to visit with you, and I pray that the President will be bold and sign the executive order, will lead with the executive order that may lead to comprehensive immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship for those who are living in the shadows of life. God bless you. I thank you.
Thank the distinguished gentleman from Texas for his very thoughtful and eloquent observations. I think it's so important that you pointed out the President's place in the context of his legacy relating to his election, because I believe it also ties into his legitimacy in moving forward with executive action on immigration. This is the first Democratic president since FDR to be elected to consecutive terms having secured a majority of the vote from the American people. And so he has all of the legitimacy, all of the electoral mandate to act in a bold fashion. We know that President George W. Bush came into the presidency under questionable circumstances, didn't receive a majority of the vote of the American people. And I'm not sure what took place down in Florida, but certainly there were significant questions as to the authenticity of the final result. Came into office under questionable circumstances, yet there was no talk of impeachment. As he proceeded to get us into not one but two wars and jam a reckless tax cut to benefit the wealthy and the well-off down the throats of the American people. And if you just take Iraq, for example, and his administration lied their way into a conflict that has cost the American people thousands of lives, billions of dollars, international legitimacy has been jeopardized, and no one from this side of the aisle talked about bringing forth articles of impeachment in any meaningful way against George W. Bush. And you have a democratically elected president, Barack Obama, overwhelming electoral college landslides, got a mandate to act, and there's some members on the other side of the aisle who just can't help themselves, itching to try and delegitimize this president. Shame on you. And let's just hope that we can move forward in a more productive fashion as it relates to how we interact with the executive branch. The whole world is watching, and they expect us responsibly as we move forward. Now, in terms of how do we move forward, how do we create a more perfect union, how do we act potentially in a bipartisan fashion, I think there are at least 4 areas where there should be opportunity to find common ground. I think we should be able to find common ground as it relates to immigration reform and dealing with our broken immigration system. We should be able to find common ground as it relates to giving America a raise. We should be able to find common ground as it relates to criminal justice reform. I've been encouraged as a member of the House Judiciary Committee bipartisan task force on overcriminalization by the willingness of Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives to try to work together to solve this issue of a broken criminal justice system that we've got in America. There are areas where we should be able to find some common ground. Let me start by dealing with this question of the executive order on immigration, because there's a lot of hysteria in this town now about how some people in the Congress are going to react to the president if he decides to issue some form of executive order on immigration, as if this president would be doing something extraordinary. The history, in fact, tells us that since President Eisenhower, every single occupant at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue has issued executive orders related to immigration. In fact, there have been 39 such orders from Eisenhower all the way through to President George W. Bush related to the topic and subject matter of immigration. And in fact, if you look at some of the executive orders that were issued by President Ronald Reagan and President George H.W. Bush related to undocumented immigrants from Central America and the need, in their view, to try to keep families together, they were some of the broadest executive orders issued by any president in the area of immigration. Where was the impeachment talk back then? Why are we subjecting this president to such reckless conversations? I thought that we were trying to come together in the aftermath of these elections to see if we can have a productive 114th Congress. Because certainly we know that the 113th Congress was, or is on track, I should say, to go down as the least productive Congress in the history of the Republic. That's quite a designation. I mean, the least productive Congress. And if we go down memory lane and think about some of the highlights, this is a Congress that brought us a reckless, irresponsible government shutdown, costs the economy $24 billion in lost economic productivity, all because of this clinical obsession with the Affordable Care Act. We flirted with a default on our debt for the first time in the nation's history, threatening the full faith and credit of the United States of America. It's a Congress that brought us sequestration, $85 billion in randomly spread out cuts across the government in a way that put hundreds of thousands of jobs in jeopardy. We failed to renew unemployment insurance, leaving millions of Americans on the battlefield of the Great Recession. These are the highlights of the 113th Congress. I don't think that's a record to be proud of as we move forward. So I think we could all benefit from a reduction in the rhetoric and an effort to try and find common ground. If you don't like what the president may do on the issue of immigration, you're going to control the House of Representatives and you're going to control the Senate. Just act. Do something. Stop talking. Fix our broken immigration system. You have the power to do so. And the Senate acted in a bipartisan fashion last year, passing a comprehensive immigration reform bill that was not perfect, but certainly was a good faith attempt to try and address the problem. And there were 52 Democrats, 2 independents, 14 Republicans, if my recollection serves me correctly, that partnered together to pass a bipartisan piece of legislation. And so I'm just hopeful that the House will come together and legitimately try to tackle an issue. And just stop throwing out the word amnesty to apply to everything that you don't like. I mean, in this country's greatest tradition, we've never had dual citizenship, and we shouldn't have dual citizenship moving forward. We should just try to find a way to bring these 11 million undocumented people out of the shadows in a fashion that independent economists have said will be beneficial to the American taxpayer and result in dramatic reductions in our nation's deficit. That's immigration reform, and I'm hopeful that we can find some common ground in that area. The second area where I think we should come together in our march toward a more perfect union has to do with giving America a raise. Right now, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. In other words, in the wealthiest country in the world, in our great republic, under that federal minimum wage, you can have somebody who works full-time, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. And at the end of the day, with a family of 3, find themselves below the federal poverty line. That's the classic definition of working poor. Why would we cement that into law? And so I think that the responsible thing to do is for us to try to figure out how we can come together and raise the minimum wage. We couldn't get a vote in the House of Representatives on H.R. 1010, this Congress, that would have raised the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour over the next year or so. Let's hit the refresh button and try to get something done next Congress. And this is not just something that Democrats embrace. This is not simply blue states embrace. This is not something that progressives simply embrace. If we're going to take a message from the outcome of the election earlier November, we can't pick and choose what message we want to take. How about we draw some lessons from the fact that the voters of Alaska came to the polls and overwhelmingly supported an increase in the minimum wage in that state? The voters in Arkansas came to the polls and overwhelmingly supported an increase in the minimum wage in that state. The voters of Nebraska came to the polls and overwhelmingly supported an increase in the minimum wage in that state. The voters of South Dakota came to the polls and overwhelmingly supported an increase in the minimum wage in that state. Those are four deeply conservative, deeply red states. America wants a raise. If we're looking for issues where we can find common ground beyond immigration reform, perhaps we can start there. And one of the reasons why I think we should start there is because if you look at what the minimum wage really means in real terms right now, we're falling behind in terms of where we once were, and also in terms of making sure that we are giving the people who are working on the minimum wage a fair shot to pursue the American dream. If you were to look at this chart that's before us, you will see that in 1968, only 17% of the people who fall or fell into the category of a low-wage worker had some college experience. But in 2012, that number has shot way up. 46% of the people falling into the category of a low-wage worker with some college experience. No wonder there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty about the future of America amongst the people we represent all across the country when you've got folks with some college experience falling into the category of a low-wage worker. And in 1968, about 48% of the people, low-wage workers, had a high school diploma or a GED. That number has shot up. 2012, 79% of low-wage workers had completed college or obtained their GED. Americans are more educated now than we were 45 or so plus years ago in terms of the workforce, but earning less. That's a fundamental problem that we've got to confront in this country. And raising the minimum wage is one way in which to do it. And the other thing that we should take a look at related to the minimum wage is the fact that the people who are on it, in large measure, are actually trying to support themselves on a full-time basis or support their families. You know, one of the most popular myths put forward by those who are determined to do everything possible to stop America from getting a raise, like to say, well, the people who work for the minimum wage are teenagers, or they work part-time after school, live with their parents. All they're really doing is trying to earn some extra spending money. It's a cute argument, but when you actually evaluate it using some objective, factual analysis, you see that these are simply myths designed to undermine the effort to raise the minimum wage for people who are actually struggling to support their families. Because unlike the popular mythology that's put forward that these are teenagers or after-school workers or people who are trying to get some spending change to the movies, the reality is the average age of people who are working for minimum wage numbers in America is 35 years old. 88% of the people working on a minimum wage right now are not teenagers. They're 20 years or older. More than a quarter actually have children. And 55% of these individuals, as this chart illustrates, work full-time. So let's have an evidence-based discussion about the need to increase the minimum wage that's rooted in objective factual analysis and not hysteria or mythology designed simply to evade the discussion. And the fact that the minimum wage increase has been embraced by deeply conservative voters in Arkansas and Alaska and Nebraska and South Dakota, I think provides us with a starting point to move forward and attempt to find common ground in doing something that makes sense simply for America. So I've mentioned immigration reform as a possible avenue of trying to identify common ground. I've mentioned the minimum wage. I think we also have to try to deal with the issue of our broken criminal justice system. And if you think about the fact that in America there are more than 2 million people incarcerated in the country, that is a tremendous waste of human capital, tremendous waste of our economic resources, and results in a dramatic loss of human productivity. And so I've actually been pleased over the last several years that people on the left and on the right, progressives and conservatives, are finding their way toward common ground to deal with a criminal justice system that clearly is broken, and starting perhaps with the notion that we've had a failed war on drugs that has resulted in putting people behind bars far too often, and disproportionately African Americans and Latino men, but putting nonviolent drug abusers behind bars in a dramatic waste of taxpayer dollars in a manner that has proven to be ineffective from a criminal justice standpoint. As a member of the bipartisan task force on overcriminalization, chaired by Mr. Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin, and the Democratic leader of the effort was Bobby Scott, the distinguished gentleman from Virginia. One of the things that was striking as we moved forward with our exploration was the fact that in the federal system, more than 50% of the people who are currently incarcerated, more than 50%, are there for drug or substance abuse crimes. only about 8% of the current occupants of federal prisons across America were convicted of violent crimes. Something is wrong with that picture. And I'm thankful, actually, that states, particularly in the Deep South, conservative states with Republican governors and Republican-held state legislative bodies have recognized the failure of the excessive law and order policies brought to us in the late 80s and early 90s, the fact that it was costing their taxpayers dollars, wasting resources, and they've come together to reform the criminal justice system. It's happened in Texas. It's happened in South Carolina. It's happened in Alabama. It's happened in Kentucky. It's happened in Louisiana. It's happened in Georgia. Again, these aren't blue states. These aren't traditionally democratic states. These are traditionally conservative states recognizing the need for criminal justice reform. So I'm hopeful that as we move into the 114th Congress, we can find our way toward dealing with this issue. We've got senators from the other side of the aisle who've expressed an interest in tackling this issue. And we've got Democratic and Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee and beyond indicated a willingness to try to fix our broken criminal justice system, to eradicate mandatory minimums, to restore discretion to judges, to focus less on punishment as it relates to nonviolent drug abusers, and to provide treatment and rehabilitation so we can help people successfully reenter into our society. We've got to finish the job as it relates to the disparity between crack and cocaine. It was 100 to 1. This Congress acted. It's now 18 to 1, but there's still no pharmacological reason for there to be any disparity between crack and cocaine. And we should make our reforms retroactive so we can free thousands of people unnecessarily behind bars right now for a law that this Congress has deemed to be unjust. Criminal justice reform, a third area where perhaps we can work together. And lastly, as we prepare to wind down this Congressional Black Caucus special order, and I also want to express my thanks to my good friend and colleague, Stephen Horsford, the distinguished gentleman from Nevada, who throughout the last 2 years courageously stood on the floor of the House of Representatives co-anchoring the CBC special order. And we know that the best is yet to come for Congressman Horsford. But the last issue that we've got to perhaps tackle in a bipartisan fashion is fixing the damage that was done to the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court. We all should want to encourage Americans to vote and participate in our great democracy. It's that participation that preserves the integrity of the democratic republic that has been created in this great country. Why anyone would want to suppress the vote is beyond me, with the exception of noting that some view it as a partisan means of maintaining power, a Pyrrhic victory perhaps, because at the end of the day, these efforts to disenfranchise people are bad for America. This is a chart that illustrates the fact that in the aftermath of the 2010 election, some people interpreted that midterm election as a mandate to suppress the vote. And so in 41 states, 180 voter suppression type bills were introduced all across America, in every state that's represented with a red color. Laws introduced to suppress the vote. That's how the 2010 elections seem to have been interpreted by some. I'm hopeful that coming out of the 2014 midterm elections that will actually come together. There's a bill in the House of Representatives. It has Republican support. It has Democratic support to help Americans who want to vote, vote, and undo the damage that was done to the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court. Now, the Voting Rights Act, as I close, has a great bipartisan history. It was enacted into law 1965. We're going to celebrate the 50th anniversary next year. And signed and championed, of course, by Lyndon Baines Johnson, with the support of civil rights leaders, Dr. King, and of course our own Congressman John Lewis. But every time the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized, it was reauthorized by a Republican president. It was reauthorized in 1970, signed into law by President Richard Nixon. And then it was reauthorized again in 1975, signed into law by President Gerald Ford. And then the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized again in 1982, signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. And then it was reauthorized again in 2006, signed into law by President George W. Bush. It has a great bipartisan history. If we're looking for areas where we can find common ground, where there's an opportunity for Democrats and Republicans, for conservatives and progressives to work together, we've got a lot of options. We can fix our broken immigration system. We can deal with criminal justice reform. We can give America a raise, and we can fix the Voting Rights Act on the occasion of our celebrating the 50th anniversary of its passage. And so I'm hopeful that we can put the dysfunction and the obfuscation and the government shutdowns and the impeachment talk and the sequestration and the serial flirtation with the debt ceiling and defaulting behind us, come together, find common ground, and march toward a more perfect union in the 114th Congress. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman have a motion?
I motion that we do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
The House is